Let's talk ADHD. So hi, this is Out of the Forest. This is Kaylee, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey with ADHD. In my other episode, I talked a little bit about my journey with anxiety and how that has worked with my ADHD or worked against it or whatever. So I think I was diagnosed with ADHD in 79, 80, and the way it manifested in me is like what people typically understand about ADHD or ADD is that it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And during, I think, like early on, they thought that ADHD was not really manifesting in girls. And that if it did, it was primarily that it was, spacey, they were daydreamy, and they kind of got lost and forgotten about, or, they got overlooked in terms of diagnosis. Boys, on the other hand, very rambunctious, they tend to be a lot more aggressive, that kind of stuff, so they would tend to be diagnosed earlier and faster and more than a lot of girls. However, with me, because I had my anxiety and my emotional dysregulation stuff, that kind of made me stick out like a sore thumb. I had a lot of meltdowns. I wasn't able to concentrate very well, and I would get very overwhelmed and I would have meltdowns. I was very hyperactive, etc. So I got identified very quickly, I think, with that there was something wrong with me. And I hate to put it that way, but there was. And I don't know, I started to see a psychiatrist when I was very young, and I remember I had to go to the psychiatrist, and I would go and I would bring my Barbies to the psychiatrist, and he had these really stupid looking puppets, and I hated being in this office. It was horrible, and I would fall asleep in his office, and and I just generally didn't like going to him. And eventually I went to a female psychiatrist when I got a little bit older. But I had the slew of testing. I was put on Ritalin, I was put on Dexedrine. Because I was in a private school, that didn't really, I think that if I had been in a public school, it probably would have been worse, but private school, it wasn't much better, because the private school during this time, while my mother could afford to pay for tutors and there was a lot of help, I went to like summer camp for troubled kids. I did summer school with these programs on helping to read and like these reading schools and stuff like that. I had tutors, I had special help, but I would have these meltdowns in class, and some of my teachers that I had were very compassionate, and they would take me out of class and allow me to sit in the teacher's lounge so I could have a calm, quiet space in which to study. But I had been put on Ritalin, and I had been put later on Dexedrine, and in that, I don't know if they still call it hyper pill, but when I was a kid, that was like, you always, oh, did you take your hyper pill? And that would always be kind of a taunt. They would always talk about, did you take your hyper pill? And I had a couple of friends that were girls, but generally they didn't really like me. I tended to hang out with the other hyperactive ADHD boys. I just related to them better. And the girls, and as when I was young, it was one thing, but as you get older, and this is like from 1st through 6th grade, as you get older, you start noticing boys, people start maturing, and when you're not maturing the way your friends are, then that even ostracizes you, even more. And I would get bullied a lot. I had people that would I would go out on the playground and they said, we don't want to, go away. Why are you here? And I would go into the teacher and say, I don't want to go out to recess. And she's like, you got to go out to recess. And it was really pretty miserable. I really didn't like it. And needless to say, after my 6th grade, I was not asked to matriculate. I didn't get kicked out, but I was asked not to go on to 7th grade. And this is a very notable private school in the city that I grew up in, and they didn't really want to have somebody like me bringing down their grades. It's like, today people are kind of bending over backwards, creating IEPs and doing all this stuff to really kind of help identify kids that have these problems. Well, back then, well, if you had the money to do it, even in a private school, the private school may not really want to deal with this. Public school may have been required to deal with it, but I probably would have, fallen through the cracks. I may have dealt with even more bullying, but I still dealt with bullying in private schools. And I think that I was ostracized and they wanted to shut me out more because I was, they were this prestigious school and they didn't want somebody with problems like I had to be in their establishment that's possibly bringing down their reputation. So that's why I was not asked to go back. And I ended up going to another private school. It was a very small, tiny Episcopalian school of only at like pre-K through 8th grade, and there was only 100 students when I was there. It's a lot larger now, but there was only like 13 kids in my own class. And when I graduated from 8th grade, there was only 13 students. But of course now we have the problem that it's a very small school. I'm a new student and I still have these problems. And so I again got targeted for bullying. I was a new student and I had problems, and because I was also taken out of class there to get extra tutoring or whatever, I was a big target for this. And I got dubbed the moniker Speedy. That was my nickname when I was at this school, because I was very hyperactive. And this was when I was in 7th and 8th grade. And so my problems just kind of followed me as I went along, and it just, I was always very depressed, and I remember when I was in grade school, this other school, being in my own fantasy world. That's one of the daydreaminess is a big thing. And I daydreamed a lot because I didn't have any friends, or I had very few friends. And so I found safety in creating these elaborate fantasy worlds. And I really just kind of lived in my own head. I didn't really interact normally with other people or my peers because they didn't treat me very well. And I had this one friend and her sister that I would go over and play with, and she would be fine, and she had issues too, but she was more popular than I was, and so I would go over there, and then I was the target of the bullying when I would go over, and there's these other kids on the street, and they would pick on me and stuff like that. But I remember going to the same tutoring workshops with her. When we'd have summer school, we had this summer school reading program that we had to do together. So we had a lot of similar issues, like she had stuff, but she managed to continue onward, and despite all her problems, my problems just kind of got me kicked out, essentially. So I remember being in class one day, and this is probably in 6th grade, and I had this bizarre awareness sitting in class because the teacher asked the class a question, And I looked around, and the students they're raising their hands. And I'm like, and I remember having this realization, like, people are actually paying attention? Like, that was a big kind of weird thing. Like, I thought that no one paid attention. Like, oh, school, you just don't pay attention. It's like, I was just kind of like going, wow, people are actually raising their hand and listening to what the teacher is. And it was just kind of this weird perception that I had when I was in school. And then I managed to get into high school. And from 8th grade, I went into high school, and I went to a Catholic high school. And again, I don't think that there was any adults in the room, because the school that I chose was out in some suburbia area, which was, I don't know why I chose the school, because it was very far away from where I think, and I don't know why I was allowed to choose it anyway. And I thought it was so neat because they had what were called open classrooms, and they were they were open classrooms. So it was like one big room, and they would just be divided by movable walls and bookshelves, and they weren't enclosed in quiet spaces. So there was a lot of ambient noise that would be very distractible. And then you also had this modular system, which a mod was 20 minutes. And so each class would be 2 mods. And it was very structured like a college would be, that you're more in control, like you create your own schedule, you had more control over your schedule, and you had to maintain it. They didn't have bells where, okay, you have this, and this. And it was like you could kind of do what you wanted to do. You might have, a big, possibly all these mods in between, and it was very unstructured. And I thought at the time, this will train me to be disciplined. And of course, it had the exact opposite effect. It just aggravated my symptoms. I struggled like crazy in 9th grade. I don't know what I was thinking. I still had problems. I couldn't concentrate because of these open classrooms. I would forget to go to a class because I was in control of my own schedule. So I had to remember where I needed to be. I don't know why somebody didn't say, this is not a good fit for you. They just thought, oh, okay, well, and to top it off, they didn't have busing out there. I didn't have a car at the time, so I was relying on a senior to drive me all the way out to the school. So needless to say, that only lasted for a year. But one time at this school, because of the way I was, again, the bullying continued into my high school years, because I would zone out. The seniors had a stereo system, and they would play music, and of course, me being hyperactive, and I loved to dance, I would dance in the lunchroom. And then, and there was another time, and I would dance in the lunchroom, and which isn't abnormal at all. And then there was another time, I remember people that have ADHD sometimes tend to be, we're running like we have a motor in us. That's what they call it. And it's like, I'll shake my leg, like I'll just be, kind of just have to keep moving. And I remember I was in the lunchroom, and because of the way the school was built, there were these movable walls, and there's a classroom on the other side of one of these movable walls, and I'm on the other side of the wall in the lunchroom, and I'm leaning my chair back against this wall, and I'm just kind of zoned out. The music's playing, and I sit there, and sorry, there's emergency vehicles. Zoning out, and I just sat there, and I would be like leaning my chair up against this wall, and I was banging my head against the movable wall, and I just completely forgetting there's another classroom on the other side. And I'm just doing this, just kind of like out in left field, And the teacher comes into the lunchroom and she just comes right up to me and she said, what are you doing? We can totally hear you. I was like, what is your problem? Like, we can totally hear you banging on the wall, right? And I just like, oh, I'm sorry, you know? I mean, I just kind of would go out into left field. And as I said, I would dance and do all this other kind of stuff. So one day my so-called friends, I'm air quoting here, confronted me in the lunchroom, and I was sitting at the table, and they come around to me and they said, and this is literally verbatim, Kaylee, we don't want to be your friend anymore. You're weird. You dance in the lunchroom and you do these weird things and looks like you're on drugs. And when people see us with you, they think we're on drugs too, and we don't want to be affiliated with you. We don't want to be associated with you anymore, and we don't want to be your friend. They told me that almost verbatim. And I'm just sitting there in 9th grade, and every single one of the girls, and there's an all-girls Catholic school, I was just like, wow. I mean, I was flabbergasted. And it wasn't actually until like a whole month or so later that only 2 of them came up to me afterwards and actually apologized for what they said to me and how they treated me. Only 2. Anyway, that's, you know, this bullying. I mean, people don't want to be around people that are weird, and kids and teens can be very cruel with that. It's like, if you don't fit in, and I never fit in, I struggled, you are ostracized. So then I transferred to another high school, another Catholic all-girls high school, and that was more traditional. I still struggled, and but I did a little bit better, maybe not, I don't know. But I did really still struggle, and I was failing one of my major classes, and if I had failed this class, I would not get the college preparatory diploma, and I would have to go to summer school. And so they sat me down, and you know, I'd been having, I think I had some tutors again, but I was going to psychiatrist again, and I was, you know, and they said, if you don't pass this class, you're not going to graduate, essentially. You're going to have to go through graduate school, or you're going to have to go through summer school. And this is my senior year in high school. And for some reason, somehow, I sat down, my mother helped me, this is an anatomy and biology, and she's a doctor, and I sat down and I managed to pass the last 3 tests in that class, and I got A's in these 3 last tests, thus bringing my failing grade up to a passing grade, and I graduated. And so that was, you know, that was profound, and I'll tell you about that a little bit more. The other class that I felt really like, that I felt a kinship with was British literature, and I had this great teacher in British lit, and she was actually quite young, and she had a poster of David Bowie on the door. She would let us watch Monty Python. She was awesome. She was so great. She would have these free writing classes, and where we could like spend 10-15 minutes just writing whatever. And I remember her comments on my paperwork saying, you remind me so much of myself. You know, you have such great ideas. Let's just work on trying to get them formulated. She really saw something in me and really was wanting to work with me to try and kind of hone my writing ability and everything, and trying to get it into a better format and into a more, you know, just improve my writing. She she unfortunately passed away several years after I graduated from high school, and it was very sad because she really was a big inspiration to me. I still don't feel like I'm that solid of a writer, but she always kind of inspired me, and she's the one person that I think keeps me going with trying to improve myself. So this anatomy and physiology class, I managed to pass it, bring it up, and I managed to get into a college. I didn't apply to too many, but I did manage to get into this one college. I'm like, all right, great. And I remember the night of my graduation, my anatomy and physiology teacher came up to me and said, you really, really earned this. And it really made, and my British literature teacher said the same thing. And I knew that it was really a profound compliment that they saw that. They believed in me. So, anyway, so that was big, I think that, I had been going to a psychiatrist all through that time period, and I think I was still on Ritalin and Dexedrine, but I started to also have more depression during that time. Again, I was kind of very in my own world. I didn't really go out and socialize too much. I didn't have that kind of stuff, and I remember there was one time when I had a meltdown in high school, and a friend of mine came and we skipped class and she talked to me, and I suddenly just became really depressed, and I remember she just talked to me and helped me. And anyway, and then I go off to college, and I'll talk more about my college years and everything like that, but that's kind of where my ADHD manifested when I was growing up. And I never really felt that there was many adults in the room with me. I mean, there were, but there weren't. There were people, I think, that were kind of shoving me along, not really wanting to deal with it. I think that my parents were divorced. My mother was a doctor. She actually was later on diagnosed with ADHD herself. And depression and anxiety. So she had her own issues. She, I think, was doing the best she could. I think she was getting a lot of very bad advice from people. And I think a lot of people at the time were just like, we don't want to deal with you. I remember there was a time in high school, I think I was a sophomore, and we would line up for study hall, and kind of had to wait there for several minutes, and I was standing by the wall with the pencil sharpener, and I was playing with the pencil sharpener, and I got pencil lead on my fingers, and I absentmindedly, being in my own little world, I'm starting to wipe my fingers off on the wall, this white wall, as we're standing in line waiting to go up to the study hall. And I didn't think much about it. I'm like, oh, I got pencil lead, and I just wiped it on the wall. And so we go up to study hall. The teacher comes in, and she's like, someone put pencil lead all over my wall. Who was it? And she was a really mean teacher. And I was just like, I just went, oh my God, that was me. And so I was like, oh shit. So I go up to her because I thought, that's what you do. You owe up to your stuff. And I said, I'm sorry, that was me. And I said, I'll clean it up. And she just reamed into me. She was like, why did you do that? Do you do this stuff at home? What's your problem? Blah, 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 blah. I mean, didn't say, thank you very much for doing this, thanks for, confessing to it, blah, 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 blah. She just made me feel worse. She just didn't support me in the fact that I was honest. I could have just sat there and said, I'm not fucking telling you who did that, And so I go and I clean the thing up, and I'm like, I owned my crap, right? I go back to study hall, and there's these students, and they're like, why did you admit to that? And I just looked at them and I said, because that's what you do, I was never trying to wheedle out of anything or be bad. I mean, I just, had this issue, and I would just be like, oh, whatever. I mean, I just go off into my la la land. But remember that, teachers and adults, if you can find incredible adults in your life, if you can find incredible teachers in your life, you are so lucky, because there are some crappy ass teachers out there, and there's crappy ass mentors, and there's people who will give you bad advice, and they will give you bad information, and and that can really ruin you. There's people who are not paying attention to what's going on, or people that don't know what questions to ask. My mother, very well-meaning, loving person, she had her own issues. She was struggling too. I think she was seeking answers, and there were people in the 80s when things weren't as well known. I mean, we didn't have all the luxuries of IEP. They just kind of threw you on medication and they hoped that you would outgrow it. I mean, that was really kind of the reality of the 80s. And I think people were like, what's wrong with you? There's something. I mean, it was looked more really abnormally in the 70s and the 80s. Now it's kind of like, okay, you've got these problems, we're just going to deal with it. And I think there's a healthier attitude today about it. But when I was a kid, it was like, you're abnormal, there's something wrong with you. Even the teachers, I mean, if you had a teacher that was compassionate and loving and cared, they would give you the tools, But I mean, I had babysitters that would let me eat, Mountain Dew and Super Sugar Crisp cereal every day. So my diet was very poor. My mother did her best, I mean, she was a doctor. It's not like we did not have good food, but, she tried to cook good meals and stuff. But again, this was the 70s and the 80s. This was the start of the microwave meal. Nobody was really putting, and not that sugar causes ADHD, but obviously we know that eating too much sugar and the whole cortisol and the blood sugar and the whole 9 yards was aggravating all of these issues for me. And I would, have these crash. I would fall asleep in the middle of class, on and on and on, and nobody was sitting there saying, wait a minute. And also the other thing too is that outside of my 1st through 6th grade, I didn't have a cafeteria. It was only through 1st through 6th grade that I was actually even getting a lunch. I had to bring my own lunch to school, and 7th and 8th grade was really the only time when I would actually have someone make me a lunch, like a sandwich and some chips. When I got into high school, I was on my own because I was expected to somehow be able to figure out what to eat, to have money to eat, to have someone prepare me a meal, or to teach me how to prepare a meal. I mean, people go, well, why weren't you making your own? I'm like, well, yeah, good question. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, this is the 80s, and it's like, you didn't have the options and the information that you have now. It's like back then it was like you ate a sandwich and some chips. That was it, I was lucky. It's like I would scrounge some money, and it's not that we were poor or anything, but it was like I was never given an allowance because I just didn't, and so I never really learned how to manage money very well. But I would always scrounge and go, okay, I'll get some Doritos and a pop out of the machine, and that's really kind of what I ate throughout high school. So that wasn't helping. So I didn't have a lot of adults in the room. I didn't have a lot of the information that's out there today with regards to nutrition and the ability to be able to have, these options. There's so many more options today than there was when I was a kid with ADHD, and it really, really hobbled me. It really hobbled me. So if you can find that, or if you can be a mentor for somebody, I think that being on the internet, you get a lot of good advice, or you get a lot of bad advice, but there is some good stuff out there, and being able to discern that and to be able to identify it and help people and help kids that are going through this is so critical, because I think that there's people who are like, whatever, who cares? And it's like, that's just such a shame, and you can't sit there and just blame it on the parents going, well, it's the parents' fault. I think that parents often don't even have this information. They're told bad advice. They've got all these experts that tell them, do this, do that. And it's bad advice. It's really bad advice, and now we've got the internet, and there's a lot more access to better information. So, but anyway, I've gone on too long. That's my story. And again, please subscribe if you want to hear more. I'm hoping that I'm going to have some, like maybe a video on keto here and diet and eating and what helped and so on and stuff. So going forward. So please subscribe if you find this stuff interesting and helpful. And I thank you for coming along on the journey with me, and I appreciate your support, and I'll talk to you more later. Bye.